Hello friends. Tonight we will step quietly into the dim corridors of Windsor Castle, where incense once mingled with the stench of decay, where luxurious velvet curtains could not conceal the truth that even a king is but fragile flesh. Imagine the trembling candlelight casting shadows on stone walls, while outside, the summer air of 1830 is heavy and silent. But inside, a man once praised as the most elegant gentleman in England is gasping for every breath, his body swollen, rotting, and his mind drowning in fears that nothing can extinguish. This is not the story of a great king enshrined in legend. This is the story of George IV, a prince once radiant, charming, but who in the end became a dreadful shadow of himself, shunned by his people, mocked by his court, and denied pity by history. His life, from silken feasts of wine and meat to long nights of delirium, was no longer a reign, but a slow unraveling, a warning whispered through every wall of time. So, before you truly get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I share here. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing our map of night owls light up across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for the gentle breeze in the background, and let us slowly step into tonight's journey together. George Augustus Frederick let out his first cry on August 12, 1762, in a palace filled with light and jubilation. He was the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. From an early age, George was granted every gift that royal fate could bestow. Quick intelligence, a handsome face, a charming demeanor, and a magnetism that made him the center of high society. Every step of the young prince seemed destined for glory. Yet, within that splendid palace, the seeds of decline had already been sown. His father, King George III, was renowned for his strictness and piety. His court was ruled by harsh discipline and moral codes that left no room for indulgence. To a youthful spirit like George, that confinement was nothing but a gilded cage. He longed for freedom, for the glow of late-night parties, for the sound of lively music, and for the secret whispers over glasses of wine. At the age of 21, George found his escape. He moved into Carlton House, a luxurious residence on Pall Mall in London, and it was there that a life of extravagance and self-destruction began. In stark contrast to his upright father, George quickly immersed himself in intoxication, in strong liquor, in endless revelry. His companions were not wise philosophers, but libertines, boisterous men eager to squander fortunes with him in a single night. It was said that George's breakfast could consist of 2 roasted pigeons, 3 large steaks, a bottle of white wine, plus champagne, port, and even brandy just to begin the day. After that, lunches and dinners stretched out like Roman feasts, laden with meat, wine, and elaborate dishes. His youthful body began to change, growing heavy, swelling beneath the velvet robes. But George paid no heed. To him, the outer glitter was what mattered: resplendent clothes, all-night balls, and secret affairs that filled the pages of London's tabloids. Behind the flickering candlelight and the strains of dance music, the contrast grew starker. On one side stood King George III, frugal, moral, guided by a red thread of virtue in every word and deed. On the other stood young Prince George, drowning in excess and sweet sins. English society was divided, torn between admiring his charm and fearing for the future of the crown. But George cared little for whispers. Each night in Carlton House, the lights still blazed, the glasses still overflowed, and the laughter still rang without end. For him, that was life itself, an endless play in which he was the central figure, watched by every eye. And there, too, the first footsteps on the path of ruin echoed softly, irreversible yet unstoppable. In the 1780s, when George entered the prime of his youth, the transformation within him became ever more apparent. From a charming prince, he began to turn into a symbol of unrestrained indulgence. English society at that time, long accustomed to standards of restraint and solemnity, was both captivated and shocked by his lifestyle. Satirical newspapers exploded, depicting the prince not in dignified regalia, but in scenes of drunkenness, debt, and scandalous affairs. Alongside this debauchery came immense debts. George spent money as though it were an endless stream, heedless of reality. He purchased elaborate gold-embroidered garments, priceless works of art, and lavish banquets whose costs could have fed thousands of the poor. And when his purse was empty, Parliament had to rescue him repeatedly, paying off debts so vast that they stirred public outrage. People called him a spendthrift, a burden upon the treasury, yet George continued to plunge deeper into the whirlpool of extravagance. It was not only drink and parties, George also threw himself into tangled romances. In 1785, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow. That marriage, besides sparking a constitutional storm for violating the Act of Succession, exposed his impulsive, reckless nature. A few years later, to legitimize his position, George was forced to wed Princess Caroline of Brunswick. But from the first meeting he loathed her, drinking himself into collapse in the fireplace on their wedding night. Caroline, for her part, showed no deference, mocking him as obese and far inferior to the portrait she had been sent. The marriage became a public tragedy, with both sides hurling insults and humiliations at each other before the nation. During those years, George's eating habits became legendary, not in a flattering way. People said he devoured food like a machine. Banquet tables piled high with meat, wine, pastries, cheese, all forced into a body that had already grown alarmingly swollen. By 1797, at the age of 35, George weighed about 245 pounds, a staggering figure by the standards of the time. His body was bloated, his face round, his chins overlapping. Yet instead of restraint, he turned to special corsets to compress his oversized frame into a false appearance. Behind the powder, behind the wigs, and the glittering clothes, the truth about him grew clearer. George was no longer the elegant prince, but an addict of luxury, a body sliding steadily toward decay. Still, he strode confidently into the balls, wearing a proud smile, convinced that his old brilliance remained. By these years, the people had begun to see what was unfolding. Some looked upon George with pity, others with anger and contempt, and from the halls of Carlton House, the smell of wine, roasted meat, and his boisterous laughter spilled outward, like a warning for the decades of decline to come. In 1810, when King George III, George's father, sank completely into madness, the English court was forced to decide to hand the reins of power to the prince. George, now nearly 50 years old, officially became Prince Regent. The entire nation looked to him with hope of finding a worthy leader, someone who could guide England through the turbulent years of Europe. Yet the regency, which could have been the brightest chapter of his life, quickly became an unstoppable descent. Under the blazing yellow lights of grand balls, George still shone, hosting magnificent seasons of dancing, initiating majestic architectural projects, patronizing artists, and transforming London into the center of what posterity would call the Regency era. But that brilliance was only a thin coat of paint, for underneath, decay had already taken root. George drank more than ever before. Wine, champagne, brandy, poured down like a flood. And to ease the pains of his swollen body, he turned to liquid opium, laudanum. That substance left his mind wavering between clarity and haze, with days lost in fog, oblivious to affairs of state. Foreign guests, once eager to meet a dignified prince, now saw only a drunkard, face flushed red, uttering incoherent words that led nowhere. The feasts he hosted during this period became the stuff of legend. It was said that in just 6 weeks of 1816, Carlton House consumed more than 2,000 pounds of beef, 1,000 pounds of mutton, not to mention countless poultry, sausages, and thousands of bottles of wine. Guests, from nobility to foreigners, were at first dazzled by the extravagance, but soon horrified by the sight of the regent puffing and stuffing food and drink into a body bloated like a barrel, while a forced smile lingered on his painted face. To preserve some illusion of elegance, George relied on special corsets, elaborate wigs, and thick powder covering his skin. People compared him to a whale dressed as a king, an image at once comical and pitiful. And it was in this very period that the gulf between what he wanted to project and the grim reality became an abyss impossible to bridge. In name, George wielded absolute power, but politicians quickly recognized his incapacity. They gradually pushed him aside, leaving him a figurehead for glittering ceremonies. The government carried on, while George drowned himself in wine and opium-induced delirium. Perhaps never had the image of a prince seemed so misplaced upon his own throne. Once hailed as the most elegant gentleman in England, he was now, in the eyes of the public, little more than a clown, a living emblem of the monarchy's decay. And from here, his steps moved ever faster toward the abyss, where death would await with all its humiliation. In 1820, after the death of his father, George at last formally ascended the throne with the title George IV. But instead of a glorious moment welcomed by the nation, his coronation became a blazing symbol of absurdity. It was said the ceremony cost nearly £1 million, an astronomical sum for the time. George, grossly obese, donned silver-embroidered robes, crowned with a diadem set with 12,000 rented diamonds, trudging heavily like a whale painted up for a ball. The spectators felt no reverence, only half laughter, half bitterness at the sight of a king masquerading as himself. From then on, the reign of George IV quickly sank into mire. Instead of ruling with wisdom and vision, he drew attention with blunders in governance and personal farce. The most scandalous affair was his attempt to divorce Princess Caroline, his lawful wife, immediately after taking the throne. The English people, already disgusted with him since his regency days, now grew even more outraged. They sided with Caroline, viewing her as the victim of a tyrant. The trials, disputes, and coronation scene in which Caroline was barred at the church doors turned the entire nation into a theatre, with the king cast as the villain. Meanwhile, George's health plunged without restraint. His body exceeded 280 pounds, his legs swollen with dropsy, making movement a torment. He had to be carried like a heavy object through the palace corridors. His hands and feet were deformed by gout, to the point he could no longer hold a fork or put on his own shoes. He, the man who once prided himself as a refined gentleman, was now forced to sit motionless, fed spoon by his servants. But the most dreadful thing was not the swollen body, but the stench seeping from unhealed sores on his skin. Folds of flesh and fat emitted an odor so foul that courtiers had to cover their faces with cloths when entering his chamber. Some whispered that simply passing through the corridor, one could smell the reek of death. Windsor Castle, once radiant with splendor, now reeked like a hospital for the living dead. George sank deeper into liquid opium. Each time he appeared before the public, he consumed hundreds of drops a dose, enough to render an ordinary man unconscious. Instead of lucidity, he drifted in stupor, his speech disjointed, his addresses turned into mockery. Foreign newspapers recorded, "The King of England seems always in a state of drunkenness or stupor." To preserve a shred of pride, George ordered every mirror removed from his rooms. He did not want to see his own reflection, the distorted, bloated grey shadow of a rotting corpse. The man who once spent hours every morning grooming now dared not look at himself. And in his delirium, he raged in paranoid suspicion, then wept like an abandoned child. By then England no longer saw him as a sovereign. He was only a burden, a heavy shadow dragged along by history with every trembling step. And with each passing day, the king's image lost the last remnants of dignity. He was no longer a ruler, but a living emblem of the throne's decay. The 1820s passed like a long chain of putrefaction for George IV. While the court tried to maintain the image of a splendid king, within the royal chambers every groan, every stifling odour betrayed the truth. Each morning, instead of hearing courtly music, the courtiers began their day with the damp stench from the king's room. His body no longer resembled that of a healthy man, but rather a swollen, cracked mass of flesh covered in sores. Servants tried to wash him, to apply ointments, but layers of fat rendered every effort futile. The wounds oozed, never drying, infected again and again. The stench of death clung to the velvet curtains and bed linens, turning Windsor Castle into a place both luxurious and repulsive. George had to sleep sitting in a specially made chair, for the moment he lay down, his body's weight pressed on his lungs and heart, suffocating him. Imagine a king of a mighty empire, condemned to live as a prisoner within his own body. Unable to lie down, unable to walk, only gasping, propped against cushions, waiting for waves of panic to overwhelm him. His breathing echoed through the palace, heavy and broken. Servants recounted that at night, they heard sounds like rushing wind, but when they drew near, they realized it was the king's lungs struggling for air. On long nights, his groans reverberated through the corridors, making the maids shudder as if hearing a wandering spirit. Along with the torment of his body, his mind also unraveled. George was so fearful that he ordered every mirror removed from his chambers. The man who once adored gazing at his reflection for hours was now haunted by even the faintest glimpse of himself. He imagined mocking laughter from the mouths of his servants, convinced that all were ridiculing him. When anger flared, he screamed, hurled objects, cursed, but afterward he would sit and weep, tears streaming down his flushed face. Liquid opium, the only friend that still gave him relief, drew him deeper into a vicious circle. By day, he drank to appear, for a few minutes, with a false semblance of composure. By night, he drank to soothe his pain and fear of death. But the doses grew ever larger, pulling his mind further into delirium. At times, he believed he had commanded at the Battle of Waterloo, an absurd delusion for a king who had never left England. At other times, he trembled and begged forgiveness, confessing to priests with descriptions so graphic they left listeners horrified. Beyond the king's chamber, the court crumbled in weariness. Ministers no longer saw him as a ruler, but only as a burden to be hidden. They printed notices saying, "The king is only a little unwell," while the entire palace was shrouded in the stench of death. The people shed no tears. Instead, they mocked him in caricatures, portraying him as a living corpse or a whale gasping its last. Even those closest to him gradually departed. Mistresses, friends all found excuses to leave, unable to endure the horror. Only a few hardened servants remained, their faces calloused by what they were forced to bear. It was said they drew lots to decide who must enter the king's chamber at midnight for the groans, the endless ramblings, and the stench so dreadful it could haunt a lifetime. And in that solitude, George's fear only deepened. He knew death was near, yet his terror of it made him cling to every breath. On some nights, he begged his doctors, "Do not let me sleep. I fear if I close my eyes, I will never wake again." Each passing day, his body was like a great candle melting away, wasting but still desperately clinging to light. Windsor Castle, instead of being the eternal symbol of monarchy, had become a vast coffin imprisoning a king not yet dead, but no longer truly alive. And every ragged breath, every spasm of pain, every bead of cold sweat from his decaying body whispered the same reminder: the end was near. In the final years, Windsor Castle, the emblem of England's power and royal permanence, gradually became a damp prison, confining a massive body, rotting day by day. And at the centre of that prison lay the private chamber of George IV, where light, stench, and silence fused into an atmosphere no one who entered could ever forget. The room was draped in thick velvet curtains embroidered with gold thread, once imported from France in the days when George had been a fashionable young prince. The crimson red of the fabric, over the years, had dulled into the shade of old wine, dark, damp, as if it absorbed every breath in the air. The curtains were kept drawn shut day and night, partly to block harsh light that might irritate the king, partly to hide the pitiful scene within. But the curtains could not mask the stench of decay. They only trapped it, turning the chamber into a vast jar of rot, seeping into every corner. On the cold stone walls, a few flickering candles burned, their dim yellow light like the flame of a dying soul. That light cast the shadow of the king's body a heavy mass, sitting motionless in a specially built oak chair, covered with worn velvet. Iron frames had been added inside to bear his weight, but each time the servants shifted it, the chair groaned and creaked, like the lament of an entire dynasty collapsing. The details of that space were enough to make one shudder. Italian silk sheets, once smooth, were now yellowed with sweat, ointments, and the discharge of sores that never healed. Pillows once plump with luxury now served only to prop up a head too heavy, forever drooping with exhaustion. Each time George shifted, the pillows sank with a sigh, exposing damp stains like the scars of passing time. The smell was the most haunting. It was not the ordinary odor of sickness, but a mixture of many things: rancid fat, oozing ulcers, the sharp reek of laudanum, the sour traces of wine left on the table, and linens that could never be washed fast enough. New servants entering the room for the first time often pressed hands to their noses, but in time they learned to wrap wet cloths around their faces or simply hold their breath as they approached. Some even admitted they could smell it from the corridor, the scent of death, but emanating from a man still alive. The sounds in the chamber were equally distinct. No music, no conversation, only two sounds: George's laboured breathing and the furtive steps of his servants. His breath wheezed, sometimes like wind whistling through a crack, broken and uneven. Each coughing fit came with an animalistic rasp, making the stone walls tremble faintly. The servants could only stop, bow their heads, and wait until the fit passed, before quietly resuming their work changing linens, adjusting pillows, wiping the floor. They rarely dared to speak, for any noise might set the king off in rage, or else send him weeping like a child. That room, though grand and lavishly decorated, no longer carried the air of a palace. It resembled a slaughterhouse, where death slowly gnawed at a colossal body. Every object, every breath, every foul odour served as a reminder that this was the end of the life once hailed as the most elegant gentleman in England. The servants of Windsor Castle, trained to serve in solemn dignity, became silent sufferers during the last years of George IV. To serve a king was usually a mark of honour, but for them, it was a sentence. They rotated shifts, not to ensure the monarch's comfort, but to shorten the hours each had to endure inside that chamber reeking of the dead. One attendant once recalled that, standing close to the king, he felt as if he stood beside someone long dead, except that the body still breathed. George's skin was at once taut and wrinkled, grey where ulcers festered, red where inflammation burned, and the deep folds on his neck and belly gave off odours that could not be washed away. Each time they washed the king, the servants had to work quickly while suppressing waves of nausea, as the king either moaned or screamed in agony. Rare visitors who entered the room carried back an indescribable sensation. Some nobles who were invited admitted afterward that they had never seen anything so horrifying. One compared the chamber to an open morgue, where the reek of death mixed with the laments of a man not yet dead. A foreign guest, upon leaving, drew a deep breath in the corridor to steady himself, then whispered, "This is not a king, but a ghost left among the living." Even the physicians, seasoned in disease and pain, were at a loss. They knew George's condition was beyond cure, yet their duty was to keep him alive as long as possible. They prescribed more medicines, but the liquid opium only plunged him into stupor, while the drink weakened liver and heart faster. And each time they entered the chamber, they had to endure the same haunting questions. Am I dying soon? Is this the last night for me? Those questions sounded not like a sovereign's, but like a desperate man's, terrified, clinging to every second. The night attendants suffered the most. When the palace fell silent, they sat beside the giant chair where the king dozed, listening to the ragged, broken breaths. There were times they rose repeatedly, just to be certain he still lived. A few recalled moments when they feared he had died, only to hear him moan in a dream, repeating the names of women who had abandoned him. One old servant, loyal to the end, told friends, "We are no longer serving a king. We are watching over a corpse that refuses to depart." That line spread through the castle, becoming a shared secret everyone understood, but none dared voice publicly. Silence was an essential part of the room. People moved like shadows, avoiding sound, for any noise might set the king into a rage. Once, merely the whisper of two maids made him bolt upright, shouting that they mocked him, then sobbing uncontrollably for hours afterward. Thus, in that vast chamber, there remained only the laboured breathing, the creak of wood, and the lurking stench like a gloomy soundtrack. Windsor had once been the solemn emblem of royal authority. But upon entering that room, everyone felt that the castle had become a tomb, where a king sat waiting for his own death, day after day, hour after hour, in humiliation and fear. If George IV's body was the living proof of decay, then the objects around him were the silent, yet undeniable evidence of rot. Every chair, every carpet, every wineglass left on the table told a fragment of the story. The ebony table beside his chair had once been intricately carved, adorned with flowing patterns, the pride of London's finest workshop. But over the years, its wood absorbed the odours of liquid opium, wine, and leftover food. The glossy surface was now mottled with dark stains, discoloured like dried blood. On it, rows of small glass vials of laudanum always stood in line, like a silent army ready at any moment to plunge the king into delirium. Mixed among them were tall crystal glasses, once brimming with champagne, now holding only sticky residue, exuding a sour stench that servants dared not touch. The Persian carpet on the floor had lost its splendor. Once alive with vivid patterns of leaves and swirling designs, its wool threads were now worn, stained with medicine and marked by water rings from nights when George spilled wine or vomited upon it. The servants had tried washing it, but the odor never vanished. Each step across it felt like walking on damp earth in a crypt, heavy and cold. The portraits on the walls fared no better. They were likenesses of ancestors, framed in elaborate gilt, but in the flickering candlelight, the faces of kings and queens of old seemed to gaze down sternly, bearing witness to the decline of their heir. Some attendants whispered that at times the painted eyes looked piercing, filled with reproach. Such rumors only deepened the dread, turning the chamber into a place none wished to remain long. The bedclothes were equally wretched. Italian silk sheets, once symbols of luxury, were now torn, discolored, reeking of ointment mingled with the odor of the body. Many nights the attendants had to change them repeatedly, only for them to turn yellow again within hours from sweat and disease. Pillows once soft and white were now stained, sagging unevenly beneath the enormous weight of the king's head. Even the smallest objects bore the mark of decline. The brass ceiling fan groaned as it turned, like a lament. Candles in silver holders dripped long trails of wax, hardened like tears. Hairbrushes, combs, mirrors. Once the companions of a young prince who adored beauty now lay scattered in dust, untouched. George no longer wished to see his reflection, nor had the strength to groom himself. These items had become silent witnesses to a bitter truth. The king was no longer himself. Sounds from the chamber carried beyond its walls. Sometimes it was the crash of a glass he could not hold steady. Sometimes the clatter of a metal spoon striking the cold floor when a servant failed to catch it. Those echoes spread down the corridors, mingling with the suffocating stench, a sign to everyone in the palace. The king still lives, still suffers within that room. The chamber of George IV, with all its objects, was no longer the space of a king. It had become a grotesque museum of decay, where every detail reeked of sickness and despair. And the more one looked at those things, the clearer it became. Not only the man was rotting, but the very space around him was dying along with him. The decline of George IV was not only haunting in smell and sight, but also cast a heavy, almost spiritual atmosphere over Windsor Castle. The servants, long accustomed to discipline and silence, began whispering eerie stories about the room. They said that at night, when the king sank into delirium, the noises that came out no longer sounded human, but like echoes from hell. Sometimes it was groaning, sometimes sobbing, and at times, most chilling of all, a broken, cackling laughter from the darkness. One young maid, on her first night watch, stepped out of the chamber and burst into tears, swearing she had heard whispering voices right behind her, though inside there had been only the king gasping for breath. Another claimed that while wiping the table, he saw on the wood a stain shaped like a handprint, though no one had touched it. These stories spread, and many became so afraid they begged to be reassigned to other parts of the castle, willing to give up the honor of serving the sovereign. The atmosphere of the chamber truly resembled a living tomb. Heavy curtains drawn shut, flickering candlelight, the stench of death, and oppressive silence gave all who entered the sense that time itself had stopped. Servants said that crossing the threshold felt like leaving the world of the living, stepping into a liminal space where life and death intertwined. And at the center, George IV sat not as a king, but like a colossal statue of rotting flesh, imprisoned on his own throne. The entire Windsor Palace felt the weight. By day, sunlight still pierced through the glass windows, but the corridor leading to the king's chamber was always hushed, seldom crossed. Shadows of servants appeared and vanished, their steps soft as cats, none daring to make a sound. By night, wind from the meadows slipped through the cracks, making noises like howls. Some believed it was the spirits of the Hanover ancestors, returning to witness the downfall of their bloodline. Priests were summoned to pray beside the king's bed. They read scriptures amid his gasping breath, in the rising stench, and many left with pale faces. They spoke little, but their eyes betrayed what they had seen. One old priest whispered, "I have never seen a man beg so much for forgiveness, yet be so unable to stop destroying himself. He does not fear sin, he fears death." Even the guards outside the corridor told of their experiences. In the deep hours of the night, When the palace seemed to sleep, they still heard strange noises from the king's room. The scrape of a chair, the clang of metal, broken whispers. Some believed it was the sickness, while others swore the chamber had been haunted by the very rot and terror of George himself. And so, little by little, Windsor Castle ceased to be a symbol of majesty and became a living tomb. In the eyes of many, the death of George IV did not begin on the night of June 26, 1830, but years earlier when his chamber turned into a foul prison, when his breathing became the sighs of a soul in captivity. Where once courtly music had echoed, there remained only the faltering beat of a heart and the howl of wind through the corridors. And when someone passed by, they dared not look directly at the king's door, for they knew that behind it there was no monarch anymore, only the rotting shadow of the throne. When night fell over Windsor, the castle that had once been splendid and solemn turned into a gloomy maze. The light from lamps and candles gradually faded, leaving only a few dim flames inside the king's chamber. That was when the groans of George IV began to seep through every wall, every cold stone corridor, a reminder that within lay not a palace, but a prison of pain. His groans were uneven, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, sometimes hoarse like the sawing of wood, sometimes shrill like wind through a crack. At times they stretched into long, mournful wails that kept the attendants at his door from closing their eyes. Those sounds reverberated through Windsor's empty spaces, forcing even distant guards to glance toward the king's room. On nights like these, no one slept well. The servants said they had learned to gauge the king's condition just by the noises that drifted out. If the groans were short and broken, it meant gout tormented his legs. If long and choking, it was his stomach twisting from wine and opium. And if there was an unusual silence, the entire palace sank into dreadful suspense. Had the king just drawn his last breath? Some nights, George did more than groan, he talked in his sleep. He called the names of the women who had passed through his life: Maria Fitzherbert, Caroline, and others. His voice trembled, sometimes like a plea, sometimes like a curse. Servants overheard fragments, retelling to one another. He begged Maria for forgiveness, but moments later cursed Caroline like a demon. These half-formed utterances became whispers of gossip, as though in his dreams the king was putting himself on trial. At night, the groans were joined by other sounds: the clang of metal hitting the floor when he dropped a spoon, the creak of the chair as his massive body shifted, the hacking coughs, as if his chest would burst apart. Together they wove a ghastly symphony that the servants quietly named the music of a death not yet come. Some said that on those nights, Windsor Castle was like an open tomb. Inside, instead of a corpse at rest, there was a colossal body fighting every second against its fate. And everyone in the castle, from servants and guards to courtiers, became unwilling witnesses, forced to listen to those sorrowful groans like a tolling death bell that would not cease. But what chilled people most was the repetition. Night after night, for months, for years, Windsor was never silent. Those groans clung like a curse, seeping into every stone, every curtain, every wall, until the entire palace seemed to carry the echo of despair. And when morning came, the sun only chased away the darkness. It could never erase the lingering memory of the cries in the night. Keeping night watch in the chamber of George IV was a duty no servant desired. At Windsor, when evening fell and the palace quieted, the king's room became the center of dreadful sounds. Those assigned to watch entered pale-faced, lamp in hand, carrying an unspoken fear. Would this night bring a fit of bloody coughing, or the moment the king released his final breath? Sitting beside the massive chair where the king dozed, they listened to every heavy breath, every groan stretching on like an endless lament. Sometimes the sound dropped low, hoarse, like the growl of a wounded beast. Sometimes it rose suddenly, shrill and sharp, startling attendants into dropping their lamps. On such nights, they scarcely dared close their eyes, for fear that when they opened them again, the king would be dead in his seat. To cope with their terror, they invented small rituals. Some hid a sprig of dried herb in their pockets, hoping its sharp scent would cut through the stench of death and keep them awake. Others whispered prayers, pleading that the words might shield them from the feeling of sitting beside a living corpse. A few chose numbness, fixing their gaze on the flame of a candle, silently counting numbers over and over to avoid listening to the relentless groans behind them. Yet none escaped the haunting. By dawn, when their shift ended, the servants left the chamber pale and hollow-eyed. They shared fragments of stories in the kitchens, in the storerooms, in the back courtyards. Some swore they heard the king whisper apologies to someone unseen. Others claimed he broke down, sobbing out the name Maria. One old attendant insisted he once heard the groans twist into cackling laughter, stretching into the dark, chilling him as though he had been standing in a graveyard. These stories, embroidered or not, reflected the common dread of the entire palace. Little by little, the groans of George IV ceased to be mere sounds of sickness. They became a symbol, a sign of decline, of a throne in decay. And the servants, with trembling hearts, understood that they were witnessing not only the death of a man, but the slow rot of a dynasty. On one night, when the groaning dragged on until nearly dawn, a guard outside knocked on the door, asking if the king needed help. The servant inside only shook his head and whispered, "No one can help anymore. We just sit here and listen as he rots away." That sentence later spread through the castle, repeated like a curse. The groans of George IV imprisoned not only the attendants in his chamber, but reached out into the stone corridors of Windsor. At night, when everything else was still, those sounds became a grotesque soundtrack covering the palace. Guards on duty said that sometimes they mistook it for the wind howling across the fields, but pressing their ears close to the door, they realized it was nothing but the king's rasping breath. That sound carried a strange weight, slipping through every crack of the door, reverberating against every cold wall. Some guards confessed that the nights spent outside the king's chamber were the longest of their lives. They stood upright, hands gripping their swords, yet their minds drifted into fear, for each groan made them think of a chained soul unable to leave the world of the living. A few even crossed themselves quietly, hoping divine power might dispel the unease. It was not only the guards, those working farther away also felt its reach. A cleaner in the late-night corridors said that many times, while bending to sweep, he suddenly heard a groan stretch out toward him, making his hands tremble so badly that the broom slipped to the floor. The whole space seemed to freeze, and he had to hold his breath, waiting for the sound to fade before continuing. Windsor, once filled with courtly music, had become a place where everyone walked softly, afraid of awakening that mournful cry. Even the priests called to pray by the king's bed could not escape the haunting. They came with the intent to bless, to bring peace to the king's soul, but instead they were forced to confront ceaseless wailing. While they recited prayers, the groans often cut in, drowning out their steady voices. Sometimes George broke down weeping in the middle of the litany, begging for forgiveness, then slipping into incoherent mutterings. A young priest later admitted he had never felt such horror. It was no longer prayer, but a struggle between a soul and its own nightmare. On certain nights, when the groans stretched endlessly, the priests fell into silence, unsure whether to continue or to stop. A few left the room pale-faced, admitting that their prayers seemed unable to reach the king's mind. One even said outright that the sound was like the last defiance against God himself, a refusal of release. And so the rumors spread through the palace. People whispered that Windsor was no longer a royal residence, but an open tomb, where all were forced to hear the dirge of death. The groans became part of life in the castle, familiar as church bells, but infinitely more dreadful. With each passing night, the haunting sank deeper, until all who lived within Windsor felt as though they too were dying alongside the king. Every night, the groans of George IV became a form of spiritual torture for everyone in Windsor. They were not merely the sounds of a diseased body, but like a shadow blanketing the entire palace, slipping into dreams, lodging in memory. Daytime servants were already weary, but those of the night were utterly broken. They rotated their watches, yet each shift felt endless. Some confessed that after months of night duty, they began hearing the groans even when far from the chamber, an echo haunting their ears like a hallucination. They ate, they slept, they worked in the kitchens, yet always it seemed that hoarse cries drifted from somewhere deep within the castle. That condition dragged down the spirit of the entire palace. Faces that were once required to remain solemn now grew hollow, their eyes ringed with dark circles. People grew irritable, quick to anger, simply because they had to live with that hideous sound night after night. Guards, instead of standing proudly at their posts, began to seek ways to avoid shifts near the king's chamber. Rumors spread that the groans were not merely sickness, but the voice of a punished soul, condemned to cry out until its sins were cleansed. Even the courtiers, the few who still had to enter the room to discuss affairs, were unsettled. They came out silent, unwilling to recount what they had seen. Yet their faces betrayed weariness, disgust, and despair. Slowly, the king's very authority was gnawed away by that sound. He was no longer seen as a sovereign, but as a burden, a corpse propped on the throne. And yet, strangely, when dawn broke, everything changed. The first light spilled through the windows, birds began to sing across the meadows, and the groans inside subsided. Not because George grew stronger, but because he had collapsed into stupor after a night of torment. In that moment, the entire castle seemed to breathe again. Servants hurried out, guards exchanged shifts, and everyone shared in a fleeting relief, as though they too had just been released from torture. The contrast between night and day made the haunting deeper. At night, Windsor was like a living crypt, steeped in groans and laboured breath. By day, it pretended to be a palace again, with ceremonies, rows of guards, hurried councils. But all knew the masquerade would collapse once night returned, when the groans resumed their slow assault on the soul of the castle. Years later, those who had served in Windsor still remembered that time with haunted eyes. They said what chilled them was not George IV's death, but the nights before it, when the entire castle became a grotesque instrument, playing the agonized music of a king slowly dissolving. And in those sounds they recognized a truth impossible to deny. Death can come slowly, breath by breath, groan by groan, until it turns a man into a ghost while he still lives. George IV had once been a prince of dazzling appearance. His contemporaries described him as well-built, with thick hair, bright eyes, and a charming smile that set the women of court aflutter. At 20, he was a fashion icon, called the most elegant gentleman in England. Yet all that had once made him radiant turned slowly into tragedy, as his body betrayed him piece by piece, day by day. It began with his legs. In youth, George adored dancing the minuet, the country dance at glittering balls, his steps light as though gliding across polished wood. But by middle age, his legs began to swell. Gout, the disease of the wealthy, came to George early and cruel. The joints of his toes inflamed, crimson and agonizing, so that even the lightest touch made him cry out. Gradually, wearing shoes became torture. Cobblers crafted wide, soft shoes for him, but even then each step cut like a knife. In time, George could scarcely walk unaided, forced to be carried by servants or sit in a wheeled chair. The legs that had once carried him to the dance floor now chained him to a special seat, making him a prisoner of his own body. Next came the eyes. George had once been famous for his piercing blue gaze, the kind that could make anyone feel as though they were the sole focus of his attention. But then cataracts set in, like a thick fog descending. The world grew ever dimmer. Faces around him blurred into vague shapes. The beloved paintings in his palace dissolved into blotches of colour. Doctors attempted surgery, a crude, agonizing procedure, but it failed. By the late 1820s, George was nearly blind. For a man who had lived to admire his own reflection, it was a cruel punishment. He could no longer see himself, no longer see the light glinting on diamonds, no longer see the admiration in others' eyes. His hands betrayed him too. Once soft and graceful, accustomed to writing love letters and signing elegant lines, they fell victim to gout. The disease that twisted his feet crept upward into his joints. His fingers swelled and bent until he could no longer hold a pen. George's refined signature, the pride of his life, disappeared. Parliament was forced to create a special seal to stamp in place of his hand, while he sat helpless, watching others perform what had once been the mark of his identity. Those hands not only lost their function, but stripped him of the last shred of self-respect. The body of George IV, once a glittering shell for a life of luxury, had begun to rebel. No longer a tool of pleasure, it became his tormentor, exacting revenge for years of indulgence. And each day, George sat in his chair, feeling his body abandon him piece by piece, betraying him, turning him into a ghost while still alive. If his legs, his eyes, and his hands had already made him a prisoner within his own form, his internal organs were crueler still, silent rebels torturing him from the inside out. His heart, once quickened by the excitement of the ballroom, now laboured under a body of more than 280 pounds. Fat encircled it like a rope, each beat a desperate struggle. At times George gasped, clutching his chest, as though an invisible hand was strangling him from within. Servants who witnessed it stood frozen in fear while he screamed for doctors, demanding stronger doses of opium. But the drug only dulled his mind. His heart still buckled under the crushing weight. His liver, too, had been ravaged by decades of drinking. Nights of feasting, barrels of wine, brandy and champagne had turned it into a hardened, scarred mass. The physicians knew well that his liver no longer functioned, but none dared speak the truth aloud. Each time they looked at his greyish skin, his clouded eyes, they saw the unmistakable signs of disease. Yet George kept drinking, for he preferred to die in intoxication rather than face the merciless truth. His lungs, too, suffered mercilessly. The immense weight of his body pressed down on his chest, making every breath a battle. George could not lie flat for fear of suffocation, forced instead to sleep sitting upright in his specially built chair. At night, his attendants heard his breathing echo like a torn bellows, sometimes loud, sometimes faint, always broken. There were nights when he woke in terror, clutching his chest and shouting, "I am suffocating!" In those moments, the entire palace shuddered. For all knew he spoke no exaggeration. His stomach, the organ that had once indulged his gluttony, now betrayed him with the cruelest vengeance. Food no longer digested, building into agonizing cramps. He ate while his body rebelled, swallowed while his guts clenched. Often, only hours after a lavish feast, he would vomit it all back up, filling the chamber with a stench of half-digested meat mixed with opium and sour wine. Servants cleaned in silence, but their exchanged glances said everything. The king was rotting from the inside out. The organs that had labored quietly for decades now rose in revolt. His heart exhausted, his liver scarred, his lungs crushed, his stomach in turmoil, all joined into a ghastly symphony. And at its center sat George IV, motionless, gasping, groaning, begging for breath. A man betrayed by his own body, powerless to resist. If his organs rebelled within, his outward appearance became the most merciless mirror of all. Once called the Star of London, a prince with fine features, rosy cheeks and bright eyes, George's face in his final years was swollen, distorted beyond recognition. His cheeks sagged, puffed and grey-green like kneaded dough, pocked with small sores where the skin could no longer endure. His chin bore not 2 or 3 folds, but layers of flesh piled so heavily that his neck all but disappeared. His lips, always moist and greasy, parted constantly to gasp for air. Servants wiped him again and again, but minutes later sweat and drool returned. Even his skin turned traitor. Once smooth and fair, it now stretched tight with swelling, at once wrinkled and shiny, dry and clammy. Some patches yellowed from a ruined liver, others turned ashen from anemia, still others flushed red from infection. Servants said that when they touched him, his flesh yielded like dough, leaving dents where their fingers pressed, as though they were tending to a corpse long dead. The stench of his body was unforgettable. It was no single wound's odor, but a chorus of decay. Meat, pus, medicine, wine, all mingled into a suffocating reek that seeped into velvet curtains, wool carpets and silk sheets. Anyone who entered George's chamber carried the smell out with them, clinging to their clothes, their hair, announcing instantly where they had been. His hair, once so carefully tended, also betrayed him. The waves he had prized fell away, leaving bald patches he tried to conceal with wigs. At first, they preserved a trace of elegance, but in the end they became farce-heavy wigs perched on a swollen head, powder caked upon ulcerated skin. Servants whispered that when he raged, the makeup streaked with sweat, dripping down until his face looked like a blurred painting, half jester, half corpse. But more painful than the illness itself was the way George tried to hide the truth with the instruments of vanity. He wore corsets, special stays, laced tight to bind his bulging flesh into an artificial shape. But those corsets squeezed not only the fat, they squeezed the breath from him, forcing him to hunch forward, gasping. He dressed in brilliant ceremonial robes, embroidered with gold, studded with jewels. But on his swollen frame they looked like fabric stretched to the point of tearing, making his size only more grotesque. Each appearance, instead of inspiring admiration, made onlookers shudder at the contrast between what he wished to display and the reality he could not conceal. George had once worshipped his image, but in the end it was that very image that betrayed him. The mirrors he had lingered before for hours were stripped from his chamber at his own command, for he no longer dared to look. There was nothing crueler, a life lived beneath the gaze of others, ending with a man unable to face himself. If in his early years George IV lived to revel in his body, eating, dancing, painting his face, adorning himself, then, in his final years he lived only to curse it. Every organ, every limb betrayed him, driving his mind into collapse. At first, there was rage. When he realized his hand could no longer grasp a pen to sign, George flew into fury, hurling papers to the floor, screaming at his secretaries. When he saw in the mirror his blotched, mottled skin, he raged at his attendants, accusing them of using the wrong powders. When the corset strangled his breath, he blamed the tailor. But each outburst was only a shell. Once the shouting stopped, George often wept like a child. Tears mingled with sweat and makeup, running down in smeared streaks across his face. The rage gave way to despair. He no longer trusted anyone, not even his doctors. When they urged him to reduce wine, he suspected they meant to poison him. When servants hesitated at his stench, he accused them of mocking him. In George's mind, the world had turned its back, leaving him alone with a body decaying by the hour. The lonelier he grew, the more he clung to delusions, that he was still charming, still admired, that others looked only out of envy. Yet any brief glance in the mirror before it was taken away shattered those illusions with brutal clarity. Servants told that many nights, sunk in an opium haze, George muttered about his body as though it were an enemy. "It has betrayed me. It no longer obeys. It is killing me." Little by little, his voice quivered, fading to a hollow whisper, and those who heard it could only bow their heads, daring no reply. The body once his pride had become his burden, his sentence, and George its prisoner with no escape. This shame weighed heavier than any physical pain. For a man who had lived his entire life under the gaze of others, the inability to face himself was the greatest punishment. He ordered every mirror in his chamber removed, so that he would never again have to see that grotesque reflection. But the absence of glass did not erase memory. In George's mind, the swollen face, the mottled skin, the askew wig returned unbidden, haunting him until he wept in silence. In the end, George no longer felt himself a king. He no longer even felt himself a man. He felt only like a massive corpse that still breathed, but rotted day by day. That sensation crushed him, leaving him in perpetual terror, afraid of death, but equally afraid of his own existence. Servants described that when they looked at him, they could not tell whether they were tending to a living man or to a cadaver held upright by some dark enchantment. And that was the body's cruelest betrayal. It turned George IV into a ghost while he still breathed. No grave was needed, no coffin. He had already become a cast-off, both present and absent, both alive and dead. A king, yet at the same time merely the living corpse of himself. The court was meant to be the beating heart of a nation. Every great decision, every gaze of the people, turned toward it for steadiness. But at Windsor, in the final years of George IV, that heart stuttered and faltered, stripped of all dignity. The servants, the courtiers, even the highest statesmen of Britain felt they were walking within a hollow play. Outwardly the glitter of monarchy, inwardly a rot that could not be concealed. Council meetings, once solemn, were now reduced to ceremony. Papers were brought in and placed before the king, but all knew he could not read them. His swollen, trembling hands could no longer hold a pen, and so a special seal was fashioned to stamp in place of the royal signature. At each sitting, instead of discussion from a monarch, ministers heard only laboured breathing and sometimes rambling, disconnected phrases. They looked at one another in silence, then carried on their business apart, as if he were not even present. The machinery of government developed a strange mechanism. The king still sat there, but no one regarded him as the centre. Resolutions and decrees were drafted, written, and needed only his feeble nod or the stamp of the seal to be complete. To them, George IV was no longer a ruler, but a necessary shadow to preserve a facade of legitimacy. Yet maintaining that shadow was torment, for he demanded ceremony, demanded reverence, even while everyone could see the foul reality. His estrangement showed not only in political rights, but in the smallest details of palace life. While George still lived, state banquets were obliged to be held, but fewer and fewer people attended. Foreign dignitaries came and went, carrying away tales of a monarch unable to walk, slumped motionless in his chair, his whole body trembling, the stench of death surrounding him. At these feasts, dishes were laid out in splendor, but scarcely touched, for the odor of the king's body overpowered even wine and spice. Banquets once symbols of England now devolved into grim farce. Courtiers, nobles, attendants, all felt themselves trapped. They could not speak the truth, for that would mean denying the crown, yet they could not pretend forever. For every day, every hour, the decay of George IV lay plain before their eyes, and so they chose silence, gritting their teeth to continue the performance. But within, all knew the court was nothing more than a shell. Windsor became at once splendid and hollow. Thick stone walls, golden carpets, flickering candles, all were but the backdrop for a wretched play. And at the centre of the stage stood a king stripped of all dignity, while those around him played unwilling actors, trapped in a drama no one wished to continue, yet none could escape. In any court, the king's personal physicians were usually respected figures, both healers and confidants. But at Windsor, in the final years of George IV, they played a different part, professional liars. George did not want the truth. Whenever a doctor dared to speak plainly of his state, that the liver was ruined, the heart weakening, the blindness permanent, rage erupted at once. He shouted, accused them of betrayal, even dismissed them on the spot. So, little by little, the doctors learned to say only what he longed to hear. You will recover soon. Just a few days of rest. This new medicine will surely help. Those brazen lies rang out in a room thick with the stench of death, sounding like a cruel jest. Sir Henry Halford, the famed royal physician, often found himself in torment. He knew full well George's illness was beyond remedy, but each time he urged the king to reduce wine or opium, fury broke loose. Do you dare command a king? To keep peace at court, Halford complied, prescribing more laudanum, more drink, knowing his own hand was hastening the monarch's end. The noble calling he had once cherished was twisted into reluctant complicity in self-destruction. Other doctors fared no better. One was dismissed merely for suggesting the king walk a few steps to ease the swelling in his legs. Another was nearly struck for mentioning that his lungs were failing day by day. And so they learned, enter the room with forced smiles and empty consolations. Outside, they whispered among themselves that their duty was not to heal, but to prolong the play of the throne. What crushed them most was the betrayal of knowledge itself. They knew the causes, wine, opium, gluttony, yet could not change them. They saw the results, the rotting body, the gasping breath, yet were forbidden to speak. In the long nights, when George cried out in agony, they could only mix another dose of opium, dulling pain for a while, then stand in silence, listening to the groans repeat. Some young physicians, entering the chamber for the first time, emerged pale-faced. They could not bear the contrast. Their books had taught them to heal, but reality forced them to lie. A few resigned, refusing to return. Those who remained grew calloused, but deep within they knew they had become nothing more than instruments to conceal the truth. And so the court lost yet another pillar, its faith in medicine. Death was no longer a matter to confront, but something to be avoided. Physicians, instead of saviors, became powerless witnesses to decay. They sat by, listening, noting, offering comfort. Yet in their eyes the truth was plain. George IV was no longer a sick king, but a corpse sustained by wine, opium, and lies. If the physicians were forced to lie for the king's peace of mind, the courtiers and politicians were compelled to live within a theatre no less bitter. George IV still sat upon the throne, still the lawful sovereign of Britain, but all within the court knew he no longer had the capacity to rule. At council meetings, the king was wheeled in or carried on a chair. The room fell silent at his entrance, not from reverence, but from unease. The stench of his body filled the chamber, so strong that some ministers discreetly raised handkerchiefs to their faces. He sat there, breathing heavily, eyes glazed, sometimes making an effort to speak but producing only incoherent phrases. Once, during a discussion of the national budget, George suddenly spoke of the previous night's feast and demanded more wine in the reserves. The council froze, then hurriedly shifted the subject, pretending not to have heard. The ministers understood well that the nation could not wait, And so an unspoken order emerged. All major decisions were debated and settled without him, then merely placed before the king for a seal. That seal, created to replace a signature his hands could no longer write, became the emblem of estrangement. A monarch reduced to a stamp upon paper, nothing more. Seasoned statesmen like the Duke of Wellington and Prime Minister Liverpool often spoke candidly to one another in private. "We are governing beneath the shadow of a corpse." But none dared to say so publicly. They feared the truth revealed would shatter faith in the monarchy itself. And so, before the public, they maintained reverence, declaring only that the king is slightly unwell. Yet inwardly, all sighed, waiting for death to come and open a new page. That silence turned the court into a theatre. Ceremonies still took place, state banquets, reviews of troops, thanksgivings, but all knew it was nothing but a glittering facade. At these occasions, George appeared as a supporting player, dressed in splendid robes, crowned with heavy jewels, but sitting inert, his eyes dull, his bearing vacant. Around him stood ministers with solemn faces, while within them rose the troubling question: do we still serve a king, or are we merely balancing a crumbling statue? The younger politicians were the most bewildered. They had entered public life with dreams of serving the nation, only to face this spectacle. Some withdrew quickly, finding reasons to abandon court service. Others accepted the rules of silence in order to survive. All knew that this era did not belong to George IV, but to those around him, the men who truly governed from the shadows. The court, which should have been the center of strength, had become a symbol of division. No one dared publicly deny the king's authority, yet no one still believed in it. Within that glittering frame, people only looked at one another, waiting, and lived in an unprecedented state of estrangement. The artifice of court ceremonies in the final years of George IV grew ever more apparent. Each event felt like an old play whose actors knew their lines by heart, but had lost all feeling to perform them. At ceremonies, the troops still stood in neat ranks. Ministers still wore their resplendent court dress, and court music still sounded, but everyone knew the center of the occasion, the king, was only a shadow. He was carried in, draped in a deep red robe, crowned with a dazzling diadem, and sat motionless upon the throne. The stench still wafted, slipping through incense and wine, making the hall hard to breathe in. The eyes that watched him no longer shone with reverence, but with curiosity tinged by disgust. Even during services, when people knelt in prayer, some furtive glances were exchanged, faces half wrinkled, half weary. Not everyone believed they were taking part in a sacred rite. For many, it was a performance that had to be maintained to preserve the form of monarchy. And when the ritual ended, everyone sighed as if a burden had been lifted. At banquets, the pretense showed even more plainly. The table groaned with delicacies, yet many guests touched their food only lightly. All knew that in a few minutes George would be brought in fat, trembling, greedily eating and breathing with difficulty. The clink of spoons would drown out laughter. No one dared look directly, but in their hearts they shared the same wish, that it would all end soon. The court had become like a decrepit ship. It still floated, it still moved, but the timber was rotten, the ropes frayed, and those aboard only prayed to reach harbour before it sank. And the only harbour they awaited was the death of George IV. This was the bitter truth. Death, rather than pain, was hoped for as a release. And then, at last, on June 26, 1830, George IV drew his final breath in the stifling chamber at Windsor. His death did not arrive as a noble tragedy, but as the inevitable end of a self-destructive journey. He departed amid decay, leaving not mourning but a collective sense of relief. The people did not weep, the press did not praise, friends did not bid him farewell with tears. His death, instead of a solemn closing chapter to a reign, resembled a communal exhale. The world moved on, leaving behind a name spoken more as a warning than as that of a monarch. George IV had once possessed everything: beauty, intellect, power. Yet he threw it all away in wine, in extravagance, in obsession with his own gilded image. He lived as if immortal, but died like an unburied corpse. And this is why his story endures today, not as a heroic epic, but as a painful lesson about the frailty of the body and the futility of hollow splendor.